Hello again, my art history students. I'm so excited about today's lecture. We are going to be really beginning our discussion about modernism and modern art. And I've divided it up into, I think, 4 different lectures. Until we kind of get to contemporary art in the end of the course. So feel free to stop the video, the recording, whenever you want, and try to go a little more into depth into any painting or artist who has piqued your curiosity. Of course, this is a survey course, so I don't spend as much time going into depth, but certainly for many of the artists and many of the movements we're talking about, I'm really just skimming the surface. So, okay, here we go. We're going to start to talk today roughly about the beginning of modern art, 1900 to 1950. And what I want to, kind of bring up and have you guys think about is this idea that modernism, if you had to define the term modernism, there's a few different ways to think about it, but it's kind of a loose term that broadly defined can be the desire of someone, and in our case, an artist, to be of one's own time. And typically, we're going to learn about all these different movements that are led by a very strong philosophy, groups of people who write manifestos and declarations, and in many cases, they're very charismatic leaders. So one of the key expressions that is still around today and comes out kind of as a definition of modernism is this concept, less is more. And I want you guys to think about that, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to you when you hear the expression, less is more? I've heard it applied to everything from cooking to interior design to painting to flower arranging, to exercise. You can think about it. So this concept of less is more is a really interesting idea. And we're going to be thinking about, several different things. And we're going to be thinking about the purpose of art, right? That art is really now going to be much more than a visual representation of something we know to be true, objective reality. Of course, photography can do that, so painting and art doesn't need to do it. Art is a depiction of modernity, which we're going to continue to discuss what the heck that means. Art as a means of social and political engagement, and as always, art as a reflection of history or a reflection of what's going on in the culture surrounding the artist and what they're interested in. And I kind of want to start with this interesting comparison between these two painters, Monet, and you see Monet's painting on the left, the cliff walk at Pourville, and then this kind of painting on the right by Malevich, right? It's a white on white, it's a suprematist composition. You see it right over here, which is basically a white square tilted on a canvas and, against a white backdrop, right? And so the question is, and if you look at the dates, you see they're really not that far apart, 1917 to 1882. What is that, like 30, can't do math. Yeah, like 35 years. It's really not that far apart. And we move completely away from something that we recognize, right? Say it's a beach scene and a cliff, and there I wanted to give you guys this kind of close-up of Monet so that you could get a little bit of a visual, And what's ironic and what I want you guys to remember is that when Monet first painted Impressionism, people, didn't feel that they could relate to it. They didn't feel that it was something that they could understand fairly easily, right? It was this kind of art really broke the rules and the boundaries and challenged people in ways that I think we've had a very hard time understanding. And remember, critics made terrible fun of Monet. And, the word Impressionism was, it was an insult, right? It meant you kind of weren't so smart, that the paintbrush was kind of bypassing your brain. It was going in your eye and out your hand. And, it was criticism. So And now when you think about kind of these two paintings, right, you think about the Monet and then again you think about, you know, that white on white painting, you understand that we're really going in a completely different direction, right? So just think about the experience of seeing these two paintings in the museum, right? You walk up, you see the Monet, you get it, you love it, you're there with it, you've been to the beach, you know what a summer's day is like, maybe looking out at the surf. But when you walk up to the white on white Malevich, it's coming from like a different world. And the question is, do you need context? Do you need background? Do you need all of this art history to understand it, to get it? Or should you just be able to experience it on your own, right? And I think that, to me, you know, I think it should be both, right? I think it should be, you should be able to have a reaction to a work of art, to an abstract work of art. And then, of course, if you do know more about it, you do know more about the context and where the artist started and how they ended up doing this kind of abstract painting, then in fact, you get much more enjoyment out of it. So of course, that is why I like to teach the history of art, because we get to explore all of these issues and all of these questions, right? So one of the things that we're going to be really learning about is that there is this kind of tendency towards abstraction, an increasing interest in non-representational art, which means things that do not reference anything in the outside world, the actual physical process of making art. And we're also going to talk about, you know, just the whole nature of what art is called into question. So let's start with Pablo Picasso. And I used to joke with my students that if you spell Picasso wrong on the final exam, you cannot pass Art 100. So we're not going to have that problem. There's not going to be a final exam right now like that. But certainly Picasso is kind of one of the key and one of the important figures in the world of art. And what I want to do is I want to talk about this painting, the Demoiselle d'Avignon, 1907. And, you know, I just want to talk about that this painting is really seen as the beginning of modern art. Okay, and so the question is, why? Why is this painting seen as the beginning of modern art? Why was it such a shock when it was first seen in 1907? Well, one of the things that I want to show you guys is, and you know, because not everybody knows this, is that Picasso was 12 or 13 years old, and he actually made this drawing. It's a charcoal drawing. And I want you just to look at it for a couple of minutes, right? Just kind of look at it and take it in. And imagine that this was done, you know, it's a study in a museum or in a studio after a plaster cast. And many people seem to believe that Picasso's abstraction of the human figure, like the one that I just showed you, his very abstract geometric cubist shapes, his penchant for, you know, reconfiguring the body by misaligning a nose or an eye, for instance, is actually the result of his inability to draw. And as you can see by this drawing he did when he was 12 or 13 years old, nothing can be farther from the truth. Right? There's an old anecdote that tells of Picasso, who said he had come out of an exhibition of drawings by children, and he famously said, when I was their age, I could draw like a great master, but it took me a lifetime to learn how to draw like them. He also famously said that it took him his lifetime to forget everything that he had learned in art school. And so here's another sort of painting that Picasso did, and he did this, I guess he was about 17 years old. And I want you guys to see that this looks like a really sort of traditional painting, right? And so it's important to understand, right? It's important to have this context and to know that Picasso could do this. He could draw, he could paint. He was 12 and he could do this, right? And so the question is, why then why then does he turn to this? What is his artistic intent? What is the message that he's trying to convey? And so we begin with this painting, as I said, and I want to give you kind of a definition of this word abstraction, because we're going to be using the word abstraction a lot for the rest of our lectures. And abstraction is really the attempt to distill nature into its more basic elements of geometry and form and color. Sorry, I wrote form. Yeah, form and color. So that's what abstraction is. And I always give my students kind of the analogy of when you want to make a sauce or when you're making gravy and you take, the drippings, say, from your turkey and you put it into a pan and you want to create the sauce. What do? You actually boil it down, right? You let the water evaporate. And what happens? It becomes more intense. So it's a good analogy for abstraction, that you're sort of distilling a painting or an image and you're trying to get it down to the more basic forms. And, for some people that ends up with a stronger and a more powerful image. Okay, so let's look at this painting, the Demoiselle d'Avignon. And I think that this is actually a photograph that I took a couple years ago when I was at the Museum of Modern Art. It's always cool to see a painting, especially when, we're not seeing it in person. It's good to have a photo of it in situ, and you can see kind of the scale of it. And this was a really interesting moment. And I actually just took a detail of it here. You see on the right, which is kind of this moment where the curtain and her leg kind of fuse together. So I want to take a second and I want to just insert a really good video now, the Khan Academy video about this painting, the Demoiselle d'Avignon. So here we go.
We're on the 5th floor of the Museum of Modern Art looking at Demoiselle d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso.
Picasso is a Spanish artist, but he's in Paris when he paints this. The title translates to The Young Ladies of Avignon,
which refers to a street that's not in France, but is in Barcelona and associated with prostitution. What we're looking at is a brothel. The idea of rendering a woman who is available to the male viewer, but within a context that goes back to Degas, but it also goes back to Manet, if you think about his painting Olympia. And you could go even further back to the Venetian Renaissance and look at paintings by Titian.
For many art historians, this painting is seen as a break with the 500 years of European painting that begins with the Renaissance.
And many art historians see this as the foundation on which Cubism is built.
So it's this radical break that points to the future. And it's a radical break with these conventions of representation that had for so long been accepted in the West about how you make a body in space, how you create a space. All of that is upended by Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
Gone is linear perspective. Gone is chiaroscuro, that modulation of light and shadow that creates the illusion that Picasso, by the way, was in love with, the magic of illusion. But here he's shattering it.
He found the formal means to convey the ideas, I think, that were behind Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Ideas about sexuality, about the female nude, about sexually transmitted diseases. This is a confrontational painting.
In the original sketches, the women were focusing on a male that was included, a sailor. There was also a medical student. But he takes those men out, and the women then turn their gaze outward, like Manet's Olympia, to engage us, the viewer, directly.
Those two male figures give us a clue to some of the ideas behind the painting. The sailor, someone who's in a brothel as a customer, who was seated at a table originally.
And then the medical student takes on a more analytical view, who looks at the women from a more scientific perspective, but also maybe from a more artistic perspective. Artists have a history of dissecting human bodies, of understanding the bone structure, the musculature, of looking at the body analytically.
But let's not forget that medical student carried, at least in some sketches, a skull. And of course, it makes sense that a medical student studying anatomy might be carrying something related to his profession to tell us who he is. On the other hand, the skull in art history is a reminder of death. It's a memento mori. And so there seems to be some tension here between the sensuality that the sailor is indulging in and a moralizing reminder that the pleasures of life are short, indicated by the skull carried by the medical student.
The faces of the women on the right are often seen as representations of African masks that we know Picasso was then looking at. The figure on the left is an archaic figure going back to ancient Spain, going back to Iberian art before the classical period.
That's one of the problems of this painting. We look at art and we expect stylistic coherence, but here we have this agglomeration of styles.
It's a kind of invention. Picasso is allowing his laboratory to be exposed to us. There is a physical confrontation. There is danger here.
The figures are really close to us. Space has become this palpable three-dimensional fractured planes.
The curtains that seem to thread in between the figures are pressed right up against those figures. There is no space behind or between. There is still some sense of illusion. There's still some shadow. There's still some highlighting. But Picasso has only created an illusion that goes back into space a few inches. It's a little bit difficult to look at this painting without the hindsight of understanding where Cubism is going to go. But knowing that Cubism is this deconstruction of three-dimensional form, shattering that form, and then placing those fragments back on a two-dimensional surface has led some art historians to look at the central figure as one that we're both looking across at, but also looking down at, as if we're standing over her while she lies on a bed. These were not ideas that Picasso came up with independently. Matisse had been exploring these ideas, and before him, Cezanne had done this.
You can see why artists who saw this painting in Picasso's studio soon after it was painted were horrified. Even Degas, when he represented unidealized women in a brothel, never came close to the rawness, the ugliness.
Picasso is a product of his culture. He's a product of this moment. The fact that he's looking at African masks in order to represent danger is an expression of France's colonialism. Those objects, those masks, were coming to France because France had large colonial possessions in Africa. And Picasso at this time knew very little about the cultures that these came from. He was interested in them for their formal qualities, for their formal inventiveness, also because they represented otherness.
This idea of needing to go outside the Western tradition in order to express what the early 20th century and the late 19th century felt like is important. This tendency toward expressing the flatness of the picture plane, not denying it by creating this false illusion. This is a very important thing in the late 19th and early 20th century.
It speaks to the oppressiveness with which post-Renaissance culture, Mannerism, the Baroque, Neoclassicism, the academies of the 19th century, all weighed on contemporary artists who are seeking a new visual language to represent modern culture.
So back to the lecture, I think that that Khan Academy video is pretty amazing, and I think it lays out kind of the background of the shock, right? The surprise, the kind of what was he thinking when people saw this painting for the first time. People were really quite aghast, but it does sum up these common themes that I mentioned before, and this tendency towards abstraction that we were talking about, and the tendency towards flatness also, right? This idea that Picasso explores, that we can see things from multiple viewpoints at once. So if you are a person and you're sitting for a portrait, you're going to be sitting there, but you're going to look out at the artist, and maybe you're going to turn your head and look out the window or look down at your lap or who knows what. And so Picasso is trying to actually capture multiple viewpoints or these different moments in the same painting and in the same canvas. And that was something really, really shocking to people. And sometimes, you know, this painting was highly criticized, of course. It was considered by some to be an act of rebellion, these unusually large figures that are approximately life-size. And I think you can kind of see that when you're there, when you experience it. in person. It's pretty aggressive. And in fact, Matisse himself was very, very critical of it. And if you look at Matisse's painting here of the joy of life, remember last lecture we learned about the fauves. You see the word here, fauve, and we learned that that means the wild beasts, and that was really referring to the way they are dealing with color, right? That color is now detached from anything in the real world. So just because grass is green doesn't mean you have to make it green. Let's make yellow grass, and let's make pink sky, and let's make orange trees and red shadows and all of that, right? So the fauves are trying to create an emotional response, which we learn is expressionism, just through their own subjective feelings and not through anything objective or the realities of nature. But Picasso is doing something else, right? He's taking Matisse's nudes and things that people consider very beautiful, very pretty, and he's actually turning it into pornography. And he was really highly criticized for it. So, whether you like it or not, at least we all love to acknowledge the fact that this is a real turning point, and it's a really important painting in that sense. And I think it's also important to note the references, right? The references here to the African masks that we know Picasso was collecting is, it's an interesting influence on much of Picasso's work for the rest of his life, the same way the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists were influenced by that Japanese art exhibit that takes place in Paris. So that's really kind of interesting. So let's talk about basically two phases that happen in Cubism. One is going to be called analytic Cubism, and the other is synthetic Cubism. So one of the first things that I want you guys to notice is why, you might ask yourself, why is she showing us a painting by a different artist, by a guy named George Braque? I thought we were talking about Picasso, right? And in fact, we are talking about Picasso. But what happens is during this very initial phase of the exploration into Cubism, George Braque and Pablo Picasso are actually working together. They're working in partnership. And I once had a professor who said that the relationship between the two of them was similar to the relationship between rock climbers or mountain climbers, where one will go up the mountain and sort of set the stakes with the rope, and the other climber comes up, and then that climber goes ahead and then pulls the first climber up. That there's this symbiotic relationship where they're pulling each other up. And it was said, somebody had written a quote, that Picasso and Braque said that during this phase of analytic and then synthetic cubism, oftentimes they couldn't even remember which one painted or created which work. So it's just important to know that for this very early time period, they're working together, and they are exploring these two phases of cubism, where they're flattening pictorial space, right? And they are also using multiple perspectives within a single picture plane. So you see this piece of art, 1911. So the Demoiselle d'Avignon that we just learned about before was 1907. And remember, I said this is considered to be the beginning of modern art by many people. And now we are just, 4 years later. Sometimes my math isn't always on, but here we are 4 years later, and we're talking about this analytic cubism phase. So what does it mean? Think about, what does it mean when you analyze something? And I always ask my students if they're in a science lab and the science teacher says, okay, we're going to analyze something. Analyzing typically means to most people that you're going to break something down, right? You're going to break it down into its component parts. And that's exactly what analytic cubism does. It breaks objects into parts and reassembles the shattered elements, almost as if you had painted them on a mirror and then you broke it, or a piece of glass, and you put it back together. But the reassembly is not according to our process of perception necessarily, but according to abstract principles of formal composition. And so this portrait, right, of a Portuguese musician that the artist had actually seen earlier is an exploration for this new formal composition, spatial relations, and identity. And so what do you guys see here? You see the large intersecting planes that you can kind of make out. I mean, I guess when you get the title and you know that it is supposed to be a musician, what do? You start immediately searching for iconography or elements that will confirm, oh, okay, yeah, I see the guitar, I see the strings. Like, is that a head? Is that a face? Is that hair? That's our nature, is to try to look for imagery. And we need to untrain ourselves from doing that when we're thinking about abstract art and looking at it. And in a sense, you get to feel these constantly shifting surfaces that are forms and color, where it's impossible to arrive at a sort of a definitive final image, right? We also see on the upper right-hand side these flat stenciled letters and numbers, and that becomes something that the cubists are very interested in at this point, and I'm going to talk about it again. And then there's this tension between disorder and chaos, and yet it's still a very well-ordered composition. So that's a very hard thing to do. I don't think most people could do this. And you know, when Picasso was asked about this work of art, he said, no, it's not a representation of a man or a place or a musician or an event, right? What is it? It's a painting. And so, you know, this is how they begin to define it. I want to just show you something quickly for a minute, because this is the painting that we looked at when we were talking about Cézanne, right? The famous post-impressionist. And you can see, if you remember this painting, we talked about Mont Saint-Victoire. Sorry about the one on the right. I'm just going to make this bigger so you guys can see. And remember, I said that Picasso said about Cézanne, he was the father of us all. You can see why. Right? You can see that we talked about the geometry and the shapes that Cézanne has created, and that this is what in many ways kind of Picasso and Braque are looking at and being inspired by. So that is the first phase that I want to talk about, analytic cubism. But then I want to talk about kind of the second thing that happens, called synthetic cubism. Whoops, I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. Yeah, okay. And I want you guys to think about that word, right? Synthetic cubism. What does it mean when we make a synthesis, right? Well, we're actually putting things back together, right? We're putting something back together. And this is an opportunity where the artists create images and motifs by combining simple elements and actually, in many cases, collaging them, putting them down. But they're also playing, right? They're playing around with all kinds of concepts that I'm going to go over. And they want to challenge our understanding of reality. So they're using here a photograph of chair caning, right? And they're using actual rope here around the perimeter. They're using charcoal and paint, and they're creating kind of this whole still life, as they call it. And I think that it's important to sort of notice, and you'll see it in a couple of the other things, this word here, right? See the word J-O-U. We're going to see it here in some of the other synthetic cubist compositions, right? And you can see that they're probably getting that word J-O-U, jus, from the top banner of a newspaper, Le Journal. I mean, they've got all of these newspaper cuttings and pieces of music, and you know, this fake wood that's paper, drawings, everything is kind of collaged together to make these super flat elements, right? But what's important to know, and I don't know if any of you guys know, my French speaking people will know what the word jus means, right? The word jus means to play, right? And it's sort of like a game where they're playing and they're asking us to kind of question all of these elements, and it's like a visual pun, to play, to enjoy, where you're taking it off of the masthead of the newspaper. So the public is really viewing Cubism as revolutionary, as subversive, as an attack on 20th century society and norms. But really, in retrospect, we know that Picasso and Braque were really just leading the way. Moreover, and I think this is something really interesting to think about, they are in fact questioning the elitism of the art world, right? They're questioning who decides what is good and what is beautiful. And this is something we've been talking about all semester, right? Who are the judges? Who are the people who are saying, oh yeah, that can come into the show and that is not accepted, right? Right away, when we were even thinking about Monet and how the Impressionists were received, right? So this question of, how do we, access what had always been a very elite system of the art world, that separates, everyday experience from the special experiences, and what is in fact valid subject matter for art. And these are all really super modern questions that we're going to be talking about. Of equal importance, Braque and Picasso are also highlighting, I think, what is the technical skill from making art, right? So they're putting in, the photo of the chair caning, because they are introducing a sort of a, quote, fake element on purpose, not to mislead or fool the audience, but rather to force a discussion of art and craft, of high and low, of unique and mass-produced objects. And they ask, can this object still be art if I don't actually render its forms myself? If the quality of the art is no longer directly tied to my technical skills, can it be my art? And it's a very revolutionary thing at the time, in 1907 and 1910 and 1915, but now we take it for granted, right? We take it for granted that an artist can have a whole workshop, or that even I, Wendy Pollins, as an architect, can design things and draw things and have someone else make it. I mean, build it or frame it, but it's still my idea. And these are very new ideas at the time, and they're pretty revolutionary. I also wanted to show you this. It's one of my favorites, where Picasso is in fact, he makes art in almost every medium: ceramic and metal and drawing and painting and lithography and prints, and he's doing it all. And he makes this incredible guitar out of cut sheet metal. So it's a really interesting thing, I think, to think about why the Cubists were very interested in kind of these instruments, right, that had the hole in the middle. And there was a beautiful essay I read many years ago about how, what is the essence of the instrument? Is it actually the wood and the strings, or is it that empty space in the middle? It's kind of a very Zen idea, which I'm not going to get into now. So anyway, this is sort of like I've shown you three, the Demoiselle d'Avignon, the sort of the analytic and the synthetic pieces. And of course, we could talk about Picasso for several years, but we're only going to talk about one more Picasso piece, and that is his piece called Guernica. So take a look at this painting. And think about it, right? What would be the best way today to protest against a war? How could you influence the largest number of people? Well, in 1937, before the internet, before Google, before Facebook, before probably even television, Picasso expressed his outrage against war with this piece, Guernica, which is an enormous mural-sized painting that was commissioned and displayed to millions of visitors at the Paris World's Fair. It's become an indictment against war and a painting that still feels incredibly relevant today. It is about, I want to give you guys the exact dimensions, so hold on. It's actually 11 feet and a half inches tall, 11 foot 6 tall by 25 and a half feet long. So that's really important to just kind of understand the sheer mass of it. So what's the story? What's the background? What is this painting about? In 1936, there was a civil war in Spain between the Republican forces and the Republican government and fascist forces, who were actually led by General Francisco Franco. Okay? And Franco had a very good friend whose name was Adolf Hitler. Picasso's painting is based on the events of April 27th, 1937, when basically Hitler said to Franco, hey, listen, Franco, I can do you a favor. And Franco said, really? What is that? He said, well, I have an Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and I'm really trying to train them in bombing missions. How would you like me to do some practice runs on this town called Guernica? My German Air Force can, get some bombing practice, and I can help you take care of your problem, this uprising, or your desire to kind of overthrow the Republican government there. And Franco thought, wow, what a great idea. So Hitler's powerful Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, bombs the village of Guernica in northern Spain, a city that had no strategic military value at all. It was, in fact, history's first aerial saturation bombing of a civilian population. It was a cold-blooded training mission designed to test a new bombing tactic to intimidate and terrorize. And for over 3 hours, 25 bombers dropped 100,000 pounds of explosive and incendiary bombs on the village. And the village was reduced to rubble. This is actually a photograph of what it looked like. 20 fighter planes killed defenseless civilians who were trying to flee. This is after the bombs were dropped. Fires burned for days. 70% of the city was destroyed. 1,600 civilians were lost. And so Picasso hears about this. He reads about this in the newspaper. He wants to make a painting that kind of expresses his outrage. And it's a difficult painting, right? It's not easy to decipher. So let's try to look at the painting and talk about it. Everywhere there seems to be death and dying. As our eyes adjust to, all of the images and the frenetic action. And by the way, he painted it in this chiaroscuro, these blacks and whites and grays on purpose to make it look kind of like maybe a newspaper article. Figures are starting to emerge. So if you look at the far left, all the way at the far left, right, you see this woman here with her head back, screaming in pain and grief. She's holding what we think is the lifeless body of her dead child in her arms, which is one of the most, to me, devastating and unforgettable images in the painting. To her right is the head and partial body of a large bull. And the other thing that I think is really interesting to note is that Picasso, even though he lived his entire life in France, he always identified with the fact that he was, in fact, Spanish. And people think that when there are images of bulls in some of his work, it's a self-portrait in a way, or it could be. Beneath that is a dead or a wounded man with a severed arm, and you see him here. His mutilated hand is clutching a sword. Only his head and arms are visible. The rest of his body is kind of blocked out by overlapping and scattered parts of other figures. In the center is this terrified horse with its mouth open, screaming in pain, and its side pierced by a spear. And on the right are more women, 3 more women. One rushes in, right, looking up. I think this one, with this kind of stark light bulb over her head that some people have often also said is an eye. And another leans out of the window of a burning house, right? I think that could be over here. Her long extended arms holding a lamp. Nope, sorry, that's this one, right? She's holding the lamp or the candle, while the third woman is trapped in the burning building. That's the one here, screaming in horror. All of their faces are distorted in agony. Their eyes are dislocated. Their mouths are open. Their tongues are shaped like daggers. And of course, it is just an overwhelming image of pain and destruction. What's really interesting, and this is sort of just a story that I want to tell you guys, and I hope I get it right, but it's kind of almost, I have almost all the facts together. You can double check my facts on this, but basically what happened was Picasso said that the painting needed to stay in New York. It was at the Museum of Modern Art, and it needed to stay in New York until democracy was restored to Spain. And then it would be his wish, this was left in his will, that the painting would be returned to Spain, to the Prado Museum, when democracy was restored in Spain. So, yes, that's exactly what happened. I just did a little fact check myself. So on September 10th, 1981, in deep secrecy, Guernica is moved and sent back to Spain, leaving its place in the Museum of Modern Art, where it had been for 42 years. And you can imagine that was kind of not the most happy day for people at the Museum of Modern Art, because when Guernica was at the Museum of Modern Art, it became a real a destination. I mean, in addition to sort of Van Gogh's Starry Night and several other, of course, the Demoiselles d'Avignon, this was a really important painting that people used to come and see. And even during the Vietnam War, people would do these kind of moments of demonstration and prayer in front of the painting. But it was Picasso's wish that it be sent back, and they closed the museum, and at night it was rolled up and very carefully crated and put in this giant tube and brought out to JFK Airport, where an Iberian airline plane was waiting for it, and it flew to Madrid. And then in the morning, the world woke up and the painting was there. So what happened? An artist came along and said, you know what, we love this painting. We want to have an image of this painting. I'm going to make a giant tapestry version of the painting. So this artist makes a tapestry version of the painting, and it is given to the United Nations. And here's kind of a very cool story. And this is something that you guys can Google and read about, and there's a lot of YouTube videos about it. What happens? This painting, this replica tapestry of Guernica hangs in the United Nations. And you think about the United Nations, right? It's supposed to be a body of nations of the world who get together, who are trying to keep peace and agreement. And so Colin Powell is actually scheduled to go. He goes to the United Nations in February of 2003 to make his case of why the United States should have justification to invade Iraq and to go to war with Saddam Hussein because of the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. And he's trying to, make the case, which is in fact exactly what the US government did, as we all know. But when he comes out of the General Assembly, or the General Assembly, where he's going to make his speech, he's supposed to hold a press conference. And the press conference is set up, if you look at the second picture down here, in a room right in front of, guess what? Guernica, the tapestry. Well, that would not be so convenient to have Colin Powell attempting to convey to the world why the US should be able to bomb Iraq, standing in front of a work of art with shrieking and mutilated women, men, and children, the result of bombs, right? And so what happens? Very, very quickly, some of Colin Powell's handlers are able to come in and cover the entire painting, or the entire, I keep calling it a painting, the tapestry reproduction, with blue cloths. And it's kind of a really interesting story to think about how Picasso made this work of art in 1937, right? And 90 years later, or 80 years later, or what, however many, 70, 60 years later, and even today, this work of art, the Guernica, is still relevant and still timely and still speaking to the world that we all live in. So, what is art, right? And what is the purpose of art? You know, what is the purpose of art in the modern world? And how do artists respond to the world they live in, like we just saw with Picasso? And how do artists respond to everything that came before, right? So you're a young artist, you're in art school, and you want to make art, and like, what are you going to make? You know, do you want to be a good technician, or do you want to be original? And how do you sort of capture the balance between these two things, these two ideas? And so that's going to be really the focus of the next lecture. And we're going to learn about all different movements in art and their responses to Cubism and to answering this question, what is art? So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and I will leave you with some of these wonderful things to ponder. Okay, thanks.